Okay, good morning. My name's Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery on a Saturday morning. And today's class is going to be on how to grow blackberries, raspberries, boysenberries, and we'll have notes on kiwi since we have those in stock too. So, the blackberries and raspberries, which were the original berries that are pretty much found throughout the northern hemisphere of this world. And interestingly, there are some native raspberries to Australia also. So we don't know how Australia got those. It might have been some migration a long, long time ago. So these are known as brambleberries or scrambling bushes. So they are all fairly fast growing. They all can travel underground and come up. So when you situate them in your garden, be aware of that they can move, a few inches to a few feet, depending on the variety per year. Now, they're not too bad in open ground because if they send up a shoot out of place, you can just pull it out of the dirt. But if you have other bushes and trees around, then they can get tangled within the roots or branches of those plants, and it's harder to deal with. But on an open area, it's not that difficult. You can pretty much control them that way. So they all like. Now, most of the plants we grow anywhere from areas of the world that get more rain than us. So the soil is usually somewhat acidic. Normally, if an area gets more than, say, 30, 40 inches of rain a year, the soil is going to be acidic. We only get about 10 to 15 inches a year, so we're on the alkaline side. Now, it's not critical for these plants to be in acid soil, but if you have a choice, like in containers, we'll use our acid mixed potting soil. Now, most of these plants are fairly good sized plants. So they look small in these pots because these are immature plants, but most of them get quite a bit larger stems. A few of the blackberries, the stems on them are thicker than my thumb, over an inch in diameter. They get really hefty. So you really, if you put them in containers, and they're better in the ground, but if you want to control the movement of them, you can put them in containers. 5-gallon buckets will work for about 3 or 4 months, and they'll outgrow this. So it's better to be in a 15 or larger. They need a lot of these berries are quite large. Now, we do have some dwarf ones, which you can fit in something this size for a long time. This is still a little bit small beyond, say, 1 year. So now there's two styles of fruit production on the blackberries and raspberries and boysenberries. Traditionally, it was called floricane. So what the plants would do is they would grow new stems spring and summer and into fall. And then the following year, this stem would branch out, flower, and make berries. So it would grow a stem 1 year and it would make fruit the second spring into summer, and those were called the floricane style of production. And pretty much all the original blackberries and raspberries that we sold were floricane type. So they would grow a stem 1 year and make fruit the second, and after they made fruit, this stem would die. In the meantime, they were making more stems for the next year, and as soon as these finished fruiting, we just cut them off, or by fall, you can tell they were dead. Just cut them off, and then new stems would come out of the ground. So these plants, most of these plants, they have underground stems. They would make new stems that would come up and fruit the following year. Now, in nature, there are some that are called primocane, and sometimes this is known as everbearing. And what those plants do, in contrast, is the year they send up the stem, when we get past, say, summer, the end of the stem starts to bloom and fruit. So it fruits on that year's growth. Usually the top half of it does. And then often the next spring, you'd cut off the top, and then the bottom half will wake up or start branching out and flowering and making fruit down there. So they would have crops in the spring following last year's crop in the fall at the end of the branch. So those are the primo-cane or ever-bearing types. And a lot of the plants we have now are that way too. As far as fertilizers, they're not that picky. Generally, we usually recommend a fruit tree type fertilizer. And we, in the long run, we always do like organic. So like the Dr. Earth, the Down to Earth brands, they're fine. And in the ground, if you have good mulch on the ground, often that's good enough. I have a friend who's grown blackberries in the ground for decades, and he just had a thick layer of mulch, and they were growing, this tall, which he felt was tall enough, and producing well. So he didn't bother to fertilize otherwise. So fertilizing is not, in the ground at least, not extremely important. In pots it is. Containers, fertilizers tend to run out the bottom holes and they can't pick it up, whereas in the ground it usually stays in the dirt longer. So in pots you have to be a little more aware of fertilizing. You can use a time release like Osmocote or just an organic. When you use organic, sometimes you've got to fertilize every month or two. Time release like Osmocote once a year is probably good enough. Now, bug-wise, there are some bugs that a lot of people just ignore, but if you're really picky about eating insects, so there's a bug that came into the US probably a dozen, it's been about 15 years now. The proper name for it is Drosophila Suzukii. Came from Asia, Suzukii. And it's also known as the spotted wing Drosophila. It's a real small little fly, like the fruit flies we get inside our house, the vinegar flies, that they can fly right through your screen on your windows and go after rotting fruit, or they love vinegar, which is a sign of rotting fruit. But this particular one lays its eggs on berries, raspberries, blackberries primarily, and it hatches out, and it's a little tiny worm that eats the berry. And the main sign of it, a lot of times you can't tell it's there, and you just eat the berry and you will never notice it because it's so tiny. But if you're real squeamish about eating worms, you might want to treat it. But they eat the berries, and what happens is it makes the berries, parts of the berry, a little sour because they're damaged. And sometimes the berry, like a blackberry, will have some red parts to it. Part will be red, part will be black, and that's the sign that the worm got in there. So unfortunately, it's pretty much throughout the United States now. So it's hard to avoid it unless you put a protective screening over your plants once the fruits are forming, or just put a little protective screen around each part of the stem. But you can treat it organically. Fortunately, you can treat it organically with a product that contains spinosad. So if you don't like little tiny worms, bits of protein in your blackberries and raspberries, you can spray them, follow the directions. It might have to be a week before you pick the fruit, but you can hit them with something containing spinosad, and that will control the worms organically. So occasionally we'll get spider mites. That's very uncommon. But if you do on blackberries, I mean, I've seen it once at my house on blackberries. More common on other, but we use an oil spray like this to control spider mites. And that's about it. I mean, if you're up in Oregon or where it's wetter, a lot of these plants can get rust on them, which is really nasty. Doesn't seem to affect us here in Southern California much. Even though we see rust now and then, we don't worry about it. It doesn't seem to be a big effect. Okay, so now most of these plants are very upright on their own. So both the raspberry, especially raspberries, when they grow, on these younger plants, the stems are real thin. But as the plants grow, they get about pencil thick and they just stand upright. So minimal support if you want to put a string trellis there or plant them against the fence. Give them a little support. That's about all they need. Blackberry, same thing. Their stems are pretty strong too. So they'll come up straight about 4 or 5 feet and then start leaning a bit. So you can give them a little bit of support if you like. Now, boysenberry, which is a complex hybrid. So boysenberry, which a lot of people tell you that's the best tasting of all the berries, is the hybrid between blackberries, raspberries, and I believe it's loganberries. And they tend to be very viney. So these don't really go straight up very far. A lot of farms that grow boysenberries will put up a low trellis and let the boysenberries just ramble over them, keep them off the ground. So they'll put a low fence or a low wire up and then just drape the branches over them because they're very, very vine-like. So they're a true rambler. But boysenberries, which were, over the years, the literature on the internet has changed on boysenberries, where they're actually from. I read a few years ago they're actually from Oregon, brought down from Oregon by Mr. Boysen. But now a lot of the literature says Boysen, who was a breeder in Anaheim, actually created the boysenberry here. And then Walter Knott, who was a berry grower in Buena Park, was looking for it, and they found it on his abandoned ranch. He had created it and then abandoned it, and they took it and planted it, and it became world famous for their boysenberry pies. So the boysenberry, which is fairly large, it's about a 2.5-inch berry, so it's a fairly large one. Both very sweet and really rich flavor, which means it has a lot of acidity to give it flavor enough for pies and things. So it is, I would say, the best tasting berry that we sell. The reason we grow it. Now, the original boysenberries are real thorny. The plants we sell, which is this one, is a thornless version of it, but just be aware they usually revert back to thorny within 5 or 6 years. And that doesn't stop people. I mean, the plants I grew in my yard are real thorny and didn't stop my kids from picking them. So Now, there is a difference between blackberries and raspberries when you eat them. So the berry itself, which is a lot of little berries attached to the end of the stem. So blackberries, boysenberries, and raspberries are all lots of little berries attached. Each one has a seed. The main difference between raspberry and blackberry and boysenberry is that on blackberries, the seeds are inside and they'll come off inside the berry when you eat it. Pull off the stem and the seeds remain in the flesh. Boysenberries and blackberries are that way. With raspberries, the seeds are stuck to the stem. So when you pull off the berry to eat it, it's essentially seedless. So you don't detect any seeds when you eat raspberries. Raspberries tend to be milder flavored and the blackberries tend to be stronger flavored. Not all of them, but most of them are that way. So anyway, boysenberry, real famous in Orange County. It's no longer being grown much commercially. They have new versions of it that are a little sturdier but not as good tasting. So the original boysenberry is not, I believe I read that it's only being grown by one farm in California now for, of course, one place it sells them to is Knott's Berries Farm. But they don't like it commercially because it's so fragile. When you pick the berry, you're breaking the skin, which is one of the fun things, when as kids, eating berries and you turn all purple because it's just breaking up as you pick them. So it's too delicate to be commercial. So they basically sold just to make jams and pies and things like that, or it's grown for that purpose. Any questions on boysenberry? So it is a floricane style of growth where it grows stems one year, floricane, and produces berries next year. You do have to be careful. When the stems hit the ground, they'll root. So it can move through your garden really fast if you're not paying attention. So that's boysenberry. Now, one of the first berries we carried back in the 70s was a famous one called Baba. And this will be the raspberries. Now, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, pretty much all the blackberries and raspberries we sold and the ones that were available grew fine in this area, but we had cooler winters back then. So now, we're pretty much zone 10, even zone 11 in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's winter hardiness zone, so real mild. Back in the 80s, we were in zone 9, and some winters we acted like zone 8, in which all the blackberries and raspberries grow and do fine. So they were all doing well in those days, but now we have to be a little more careful about what we sell because of the zoning problems. Now, Baba originated in Idlewild. Ooh, boy, if I can remember how to spell Idlewild. And which is inland in Southern California, more inland, a couple hundred miles inland. And Lady Gertrude Milliken found it growing on by a river by our property. Her grandkids called her Baba, so they gave it that name. So Baba berry was real famous back in the 1980s. But we're not sure we're selling the same plant anymore. So when I first was growing Baba berries around 1980, it was a floricane. It grew stems one year and it fruited the second year. The Baba berries we're selling now are primal cane. So I don't know if it's the same plant You know, we sold them in the 80s and then they disappeared in the 90s. We were told that the big box stores had gobbled up all the supply. And then about 10 years ago, they appeared again, but now they're growing differently. So we don't know if we're selling the same plant or if the plant evolved or mutated. What went on with Baba? And it still says zone 4 through 11 on here, so it should produce well for us in this area. But this is one that's native to Southern California, so the Baba is now a primo cane. It is noted for being one of the larger raspberries. So raspberries tend to be on the small side. This one is a good inch or more. So it is one of the larger fruits. When I grew Babas back in the 80s, the plants naturally grew about this tall. Didn't have to support them. But again, mine were not primo cane. They were just flora cane. They just fruited on last year's wood. Now, the top rated of all the raspberries, according to a lot of our local friends that they've grown in Orange County, is Caroline. And Caroline definitely is a primo cane. It's a daughter of Heritage, which is a famous raspberry that we don't grow because Caroline's better. But Caroline is rated zones 4 through 7 on this tag. But a lot of, I've grown this and it's fruited in my yard. So I'm not sure on the rating of the zoning. We're not sure if this is proper or not, saying zones 4 through 7, which means it's gotten, this was developed in Carolina. So it really has no business being here, but a lot of our local customers have grown it very successfully, and so have I. So we think it's pretty reliable. It may not do well in some of those hot winters we've had, but now for some reason, just so you know, the last 2 years, raspberries have not done all that well. The last 2 years were some of the mildest winters we've seen temperature-wise. Because even when we had the 90-degree winters 10 years ago, we still had some cool days that got the temperature down to freezing. I can remember we still had frost. But the last 2 years, there's been no frost at all. Nothing below 30, 32 degrees or even close to it. So, but the raspberries just haven't performed as well as they could. But anyway, Caroline. And then we have the N, which is supposed to be the best of the yellow raspberries, and it is a the book doesn't say it, but it acts like a primo cane. Now, the primo cane is popular in a lot of parts of the United States also because, if you're in Minnesota, these stems don't survive the winter. It just freezes. So you can't really grow flora canes if you're in Minnesota or Canada because the whole top of the plant freezes off unless you protect them somehow. But the primo canes, they'll just grow new stems every spring and they'll fruit that same year. So like this one says it fruits summer, fall, and that's the time of year when primo canes fruit. The flora canes fruit late spring into summer off of the growth that was there last year, and then the primo canes, the ends of the branches are fruiting summer and fall. So this acts like a primo cane, and it has good size yellow berries on it. And then we have Canby. Canby is another one that has produced in the past. This is red, but we're not sure because the zoning on it, how reliable, because it's the zoning on it's 4 through 9, which we'll get some winters. I remember because we grew this in the 1980s and had good crops on it. Now, Canby is popular because it's the only raspberry that's thornless. It's thornless where they make berries. It does have thorns at the base of the stems, but wherever the berries form, it's thornless. Whereas all the other raspberries have thorns. Now, they're not nasty thorns. Blackberries can have really nasty thorns, like rose thorns. The raspberries, it's more like bristles, like a real pokey toothbrush. So the thorns aren't that bad, but Canby is known for being thornless. Good tasting red raspberry. Although I would tell you, this thing needs more than half a day of sun. I tried growing in half a day of sun at my house in the 1980s, and it was tart, not enough light. Whereas some of these, like Caroline, they say half day, morning sun, afternoon shade is preferred for that one. But Canby, you need about 2/3 a day of sun to get sweet. So. Now this one I have not grown. So there is a black raspberry. Which is supposed to be a hybrid with some blackberry in it. And the blackberry, the blackness gives it a little more flavor than the red raspberries tend to be quite bland sweet, which some people love, but some people like the stronger flavor, and Jewel tends to be a little more like a blackberry. Now it is rated zones 4 through 11, so it should do well here yet, but I have yet to grow it. And it does say it is floricane. So spring into summer bearing off of last year's growth. And the black raspberries tend to be more disease prone. Jewel is a selection that's supposed to be less disease prone, but so you do have to watch that. On a wet winter, we may have some trouble with it. Now this one we may not promote too much. This is a dwarf raspberry called Baby Cakes. It was developed in Oregon. The zoning on it, 4 through 8. So we may not, we're not promoting it highly, but for some of our customers who live in the canyons, because we have customers who live in the canyons or Lake Elsinore or Corona, you're very close to your zone 8. So, and along the Santa Ana River and the canyons, zone 8. This is a dwarf raspberry that's meant to be in a container, maybe this size. So it grows shorter. Regular red raspberries. I haven't grown it. And it doesn't say if it's a floricane or a primocane. Oh, here it says produces twice in one season, so it must be a primocane. Okay, so that's the raspberry lineup. So Bob has been around the longest. Caroline is a local favorite. And then the blackberries, we tend to sell a lot of blackberries. I mean, a lot of blackberries. The number one seller for us, for a good reason, is Prime Freedom, which is thornless. It's relatively new. It's only been around about 6 or 7 years. So prime for primo cane. So it bears much of the year. I mean, at my house, it'll start making fruit right around February or March on last year's growth. And then the new stems coming out, they'll start fruiting about midsummer and go all the way, God, it's all the way through fall. They are a little more sensitive to heat, so you don't want them against the hot wall. Morning and afternoon shade is probably good enough. But yeah, be careful. If they're against the block wall, the summer heat that just shrivels them up. But standing out in the open, they're fine. They're not as big as some of the other blackberries, so they're a inch and a quarter. So they're bigger than a lot of the raspberries, but for a blackberry, they're a little on the small side. But you know, they're good tasting and fruiting most of the year. Very prolific. So this has been our best seller for a while now, as the Prime Freedom. The first of the Primo King Blackberries we sold about 5 years ago. It's called Primark 45. We'll still have it now and then, but it is quite spiny. But it is considered a little better quality than Prime Freedom, but the spines make it a little less desirable for most people. So we do the Prime Freedom rather than the Primark 45, which we carry occasionally. Now, the best tasting of the blackberries for Orange County is this one, Olali. It's been around a long time. So this one has always fruited well for us. It's a regular floricane. It's a big berry. It's about 2 inches to 2.5 inches. And it rivals Boysenberries for flavor. So it's close. I've eaten Boysenberries and Olalis at the same time, and Boysenberry might be just a hint better than Olali, but Olali is a good tasting blackberry. Very upright. A friend of mine grew them on the side of his hill between fruit trees, and they grew about 4.5 foot or so. But very, very good production, Orange County, on the Olalis. Now this is the biggest of the blackberries. This is Kiowa. And it makes 3-inch berries. So it's a big blackberry. It's also considered the worst spines you'll ever see on a blackberry. This plant here, the stems on it grow about that thick. And the spines on it are about that long. It is nasty looking. So, and they stand upright. They don't need any support at all. They'll go straight up 8 foot before they start to turn over. It is a floricane. So it's noted for being the largest blackberry. It's good. We grow them here. We've grown them here for many years, and they're good. So, but yeah, nasty to be around close. So that's Kiowa. Any questions on blackberries or raspberries? So again, unfortunately, we do pick up the worms in them nowadays. Occasionally, you might not get them, but okay, some notes on kiwis. Now, we're not perfect kiwi climate. Kiwis, and of course, they became famous when New Zealand got them. And New Zealand has a climate that ranges from cold in the winter to tropical, but they're grown in areas, so they're native to central and eastern China, which is similar to North Carolina, Tennessee, that area of the United States. So they like to have winter, some winter, not, they won't make it in Canada at all. It's too cold there. But they like some winter, generally a little more than we're getting, although certain areas they'll do well. Again, canyons, along the big riverbeds, or inland a little farther. So there used to be kiwi farms throughout Southern California. There used to be a lot, Vista, Fallbrook, near Oceanside, but they're all gone now, because we had, like 5 years of just really warm winters. So they kind of just took them all out at that point. The winters are getting cooler again. Hopefully these will do a lot better in the future. These, now kiwis, which probably are properly known around the world as Chinese gooseberry, but we call them kiwis. We grow the types that were developed locally. So Vincent, and you do need a male and a female to grow them. So Vincent is the female, and Tomuri is the male, and you need both to get fruit, only the female fruits. So be aware of that. You have to have both of them to fruit, only the female does fruit. And they're big, heavy vines. Now you can grow them on a chain link fence or wrought iron fence. The farmers know that they have to use a 4x4 wood support. Anything smaller than that, for overhead trellis, it'll just collapse underneath the weight, because the stems on these things get really thick, thicker than grapevines. So they can be very, very heavy. One of the main things about kiwis is that you have to, well, they said the farmers, to get a good crop, you've got to prune them a lot to keep the fruiting stems clear. So when they're growing their stems, they'll have what we would call the fruiting stems that are shorter. They'll make these stems that are short and real bumpy. And these are the flowering stems that they're producing. So they have a lot of bumps on them where the flowers are forming. But they say the problem with kiwis is the new growth that comes off the stems covers them up. And when it covers them up, they kind of wither away after a while. They need the sunlight. So they say the farmers do spend quite a bit of time, once a month, going through the kiwi vines and clipping out this new growth that just covers them. Too much new growth coming out. So you have to be careful and watch your flowering stems and keep them uncovered. And if we don't have the winter they need, then they don't bloom well. And apparently it's the male that needs more cold than the female does. Vincent, I believe the story I know was developed by the late Roger Meyer, who lived in Costa Mesa. So that's a real local one. Tomuri comes from somewhere else, as far as we know. So Tomuri might have some more trouble, might need a little more cold weather than the Vincent does to bloom it. But again, you need both to make fruit. They're very, very fast right now. One interesting note on kiwis, we know whenever we're trimming the foliage, the cats at the nursery just rolling the leaves just like catnip. So, and the literature says that too. The foliage is very attractive to cats, like catnip, except they can't reach most of it because it's up on a trellis. Now, one of my relatives who lives up in Villa Park, in a canyon in Villa Park, said that they planted kiwis on their pergola, and after 7 years, they just gave up waiting. I guess they didn't really know how to train it properly. So they gave up on the plants, but lo and behold, by the 10th year, they had a lot of fruit. So it took the plant a while to develop on its own because they weren't trimming it very well, but they eventually got fruit on it. So they can be an investment in time. Now, a lot of people ask about the golden kiwi. So the kiwis we're growing are botanically Actinidia deliciosa. And the golden kiwi, which is very popular at supermarkets, is a different species, Actinidia chinensis. Now, we can't get a hold of the plants. Apparently, these were developed, the golden kiwis that you see at the supermarket were developed in New Zealand, and they're not about to send the plants over to the United States. And we look on the internet and everyone says golden kiwis for sale, and you look at it carefully, it says seeds. So they're just taking the fruit at the supermarket and taking the seeds out. Now the problem with seeds is just like pretty much most seeds, same thing. They're genetically diversified. Plus, you're not sure if you're going to get a male or a female, because again, you need both. And the seeds you grow may not turn out anything like the fruit that you're eating. They might, they may not, we don't know. In New Zealand, they said the process of creating the golden kiwis that we buy at the store was very complicated because there's a lot of variation in there. And the golden kiwis are much more susceptible to diseases than the deliciosa, the regular kiwis, the green kiwis. So if you want, you can just buy a golden kiwi fruit at the supermarket and take the seeds out and grow them. Now, I didn't check to see if you needed to cold stratify these. A lot of plants from the temperate climates, you have to put the seeds in the fridge for 3 months for them to sprout. And then I don't know how long you have to wait for the plant to mature from a seed. You know, some seeds take up to 10 years to mature, and then you have to find out if you have a male flower or a female plant. So, you know, the people selling that stuff on the internet are, well, it's not a trick or anything because you're actually getting the species, but you're not getting the fruit that you're eating at the store. So that'll be one we'll have to wait on and see if anyone comes up with a golden kiwi in the United States that they sell the plants for. Kiwis don't seem to have too many bug problems. Keep the ants off them. It's more of just investing the time and the space because they are big plants. Any other questions today? Okay. All right. Thank you.